Somebody recently asked me what the main differences were between Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe. Now, I find this to be an interesting question, and I'm assuming the reason the person asked me is because both Lewis and Bowe were the same height, 6'5", a similar weight, and of course they were rivals from the amateurs, and they rekindled that rivalry in the professional ranks, although unfortunately they never squared off as pros. Well, stylistically, are there any similarities between Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe? Both guys like to use their jab a lot. I would actually say that Riddick Bowe's jab, at least when he's in the middle of the ring or when he's on the front foot, was maybe a little better than Lennox Lewis's jab. I think it was, do I want to say it was faster? Because overall, Lewis was a faster fighter. But Riddick Bowe's jab, when he was on form, it was a real sharp, powerful jab. So I want to say in the middle of the ring, Bowe's jab might have been a bit better and going forward as well. But Lewis had a back foot game that was completely absent from Riddick Bowe. And that's probably the main difference between the two fighters. I would say Riddick Bowe was a bit better on the inside, possibly. I say possibly because you go back to their amateur fight in the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Lewis won by TKO. Obviously, Riddick Bowe was very upset about the fight being stopped when it was. He felt it was premature. And if it was a professional fight, you'd say it was a shocking stoppage. But in the amateurs, they do stop things a lot earlier. That's standard practice in the amateur ranks. So you can't really judge it by professional standards because in the amateurs, it's about scoring points. They're not trying to see guys get hurt. So anyway, Lewis got on top of Bowe in that second round. He landed some big shots. He staggered him a couple times. Referee stopped it. But what you'll notice if you watch that fight is that while Lewis appeared to be the physically stronger of the two, and that's another one of the differences, Lewis showed in their amateur fight that he was physically stronger than Bowe. While he showed that, Bowe showed a better inside game than Lewis in that fight. He actually bloodied Lewis's nose in the first round with his best punch at the time, which was the right uppercut. And as a professional, Riddick Bowe also showed this ability to fight inside very, very well for a big man. This is a guy with an 81-inch reach. I guess that's similar to Anthony Joshua or Vladimir Klitschko, but he was much more comfortable on the inside, certainly than Klitschko. And AJ's pretty good on the inside too, but Riddick Bowe was more smooth. He was more fluid on the inside. I mean, if you watch his fights against Evander Holyfield, a lot of them, particularly the first fight, a lot of it was fought on the inside, right? Despite the fact that Riddick Bowe was much taller and rangier than Holyfield. So it's possible that as a pro, you could also say Bowe had a better inside game. But then in the Ray Mercer fight in particular, Lewis showed he had a very good inside game, much improved from his amateur days. And there were even some early fights in Lewis's career, like when he fought a guy called Levi Billups. He showed an inside game there. And there were several others. But the Mercer fight in particular was, I would say, the best demonstration of Lennox Lewis's inside game was that fight right there. And he actually got the better of it on the inside against Mercer on multiple occasions throughout that fight. Mercer actually had a lot of success at long range. So this is kind of counterintuitive because Mercer is the much shorter guy, shorter arms. But Mercer had a lot of success at long range with his jab. Whereas when he managed to back Lewis up to the ropes and start unloading, Lewis was able to come back and get the better of a lot of the exchanges. Okay, just to show you how good Lennox Lewis was up close. So it's debatable whether Lewis was better or worse on the inside than Riddick Bowe as a professional. As amateurs, I'd say Riddick Bowe was definitely the better up close. But I do think Lewis caught up to him a little bit in the paid ranks. So, yeah, I would say Riddick Bowe was more fluid than Lennox Lewis, amateur and pro. Not that Lewis was ever a robotic heavyweight. He wasn't. He was athletic and pretty smooth himself. But Lewis was more explosive than Bowe. He was more of a sharpshooter. He was a guy who had more fast one-punch kind of power. You know, big single shots that come out of nowhere explosively and hurt guys, like the left hook that he staggered Frank Bruno with in the 7th round that led to the knockout, or the right hand that he dropped Razor Ruddock with in the 1st round when they fought in Earl's Court. When was that? 1992, 1993? So I think Lewis was just a more explosive fighter. Faster power punches, I'd say. Certainly at long range, his power punches are faster than Riddick Bowe. But Bowe's hands were pretty fast up close, you know, when he's throwing the inside punches and what have you. But as I said earlier, the main difference between the two was Lennox Lewis was more versatile. I do not recall ever seeing Riddick Bowe successfully boxing on the back foot. That's just not what he did. Even though he had height and reach and all that kind of stuff, when he was fighting shorter guys, be it a Holyfield, be it a Burt Cooper, or even someone like Buster Mathis Jr., he would come forward and he would fight them up close, like at close range on the inside. And that's one of the reasons that I always felt Riddick Bowe would lose to Mike Tyson if they fought prime for prime. I think, yes, you can fight Tyson on the inside. Evander Holyfield proved that, and he did it to great effect. But I feel like Riddick Bowe's defense on the inside or on the outside wasn't good enough to fight Mike Tyson that way. Evander Holyfield was able to nullify Tyson's power in both their fights by having an exceptionally tight defense. He was reading all Tyson's moves. He knew when to get his hands up. He had his chin super glued to his chest. And there was only one time in both the Tyson Holyfield fights where I recall Holyfield, in fact, no, 2 times, where I recall Holyfield getting caught really clean. The first time was, I think, the first punch of the fight, when Mike Tyson launched an overhand right and caught Holyfield kind of high on the head. That was right at the opening bell. And then there was another time, it might have been around round 5 or 6, when Tyson threw that signature right hand to the body, uppercut to the chin. That caught Holyfield clean. And I'm sure there were some other instances throughout the fight, but those are the only 2 ones that really stick out to me, where you could see clearly that Holyfield had been caught clean by a big power shot. For the most part, Holyfield did a very, very good defensive job of getting an arm up, you know, turning with the shots and all this kind of thing. So he never really absorbed the full power of Tyson on many occasions. Riddick Bowe isn't as defensively skilled as that on the inside. And again, when you see him against shorter fighters, he never keeps them out on the outside. He allows the shorter fighters in, or in fact, he goes looking for a close quarters engagement with a shorter fighter. Whereas with Lennox Lewis, that's not the case. Lewis was more versatile. You see him against David Tua. He kept him on the end of the jab, didn't let him get anywhere close. And even when he fought Mike Tyson, kept the fight at long range for the most part. When they were out close, of course, he was leaning on Tyson, throwing him around, you know, getting rough. And then later on, as the fight progressed, Lewis stood his ground more. You could say he stood his ground in the first round, but it was long range standing your ground. You know what I mean? And eventually, as the fight wore on, he was getting closer and closer, doing a bit more inside stuff, because he realized that Tyson was wearing down. You know, his energy was depleting and his morale was going down as well. So, yeah, I would say Lewis was more versatile. All round, he was more athletic. Some people could argue that Riddick Bowe had a better left hook. Bowe was really a right-hand guy. His left hook was there, and he would probably throw more left hooks than Lennox Lewis. But I don't necessarily think it was a more powerful left hook than Lewis. When Lewis threw that left hook against Bruno, I mean, that nearly took his head off. Do you know what I mean? Bowe wasn't really known for left hooks like that. His left hooks were there, but he would throw them in combinations when he was on the inside. His right hand was the main power shot that would get people out of there. Just ask Jorge Luis Gonzalez. That was one of the best knockouts of Riddick Bowe's career, was when he knocked out Jorge Luis Gonzalez. And that was a grudge match because Gonzalez had beaten Riddick Bowe in the amateurs. And Gonzalez was a very, very cocky, you know, super alpha type of guy, a kind of bully personality. That's how he was. He was really a bully, Jorge Luis Gonzalez. And in the run-up to that Riddick Bowe fight, he was in the hotel, because I think they were both staying at the same hotel, might have been the MGM Grand, one of those hotels in Vegas. And Gonzalez was looking for Riddick Bowe. He was like walking around asking people, where's Bowe? Because he wanted to try and intimidate him and bully him. Gonzalez is a very big man, 6'7", even taller than Riddick Bowe. And Bowe, on a one-to-one level, didn't really want to be around Gonzalez. I remember reading interviews with Bowe in the run-up to the fight where he was just said, oh, this guy's an idiot. You know, I'm just trying to stay out of his way and, you know, we'll sort things out in the ring on fight night. I'm not trying to get into any kind of altercation with this guy beforehand, because I remember there was some back and forth. It was quite a lively press conference. Riddick Bowe's press conferences were notoriously controversial and so on. Like when he chinned Larry Donald before their fight at a press conference. Larry Donald stood there with an iron jaw and absorbed these two massive bare knuckle shots from Riddick Bowe at their press conference. If you haven't seen it, go watch it on YouTube. Larry Donald barely flinched. He had a tremendous chin at that time in his career. So yeah, anyway, long story short, the main differences, I would say, Lewis more versatile, more athletic, Bowe a bit smoother. I would say his jab was a little better. Lewis had a better defense than Riddick Bowe for sure. Riddick Bowe had shorter arms than Lewis. He had an 81-inch reach, whereas Lewis had an 84-inch reach. And I know reach and, I always tell you guys, reach and arm length are two different measurements. But no, Lewis appeared to have longer arms, not just a longer reach, but longer arms than Riddick Bowe. And I think that's why Riddick Bowe was a bit better on the inside. You know, when you've got big, long arms like Lennox Lewis and you're a heavy guy, you know, you're 240, 250, shortening the shots is not so easy, you know. In fact, there was another thing I wanted to talk about. I saw, this is completely unrelated in terms of the division, but I saw Hamza Shiraz fight last weekend. And Hamza Shiraz is one of these tall, skinny guys who doesn't really get full extension on his punches a lot of the time. And I think it comes down with a lot of these tall, skinny guys who, like Antonio Margarito and Diego Corrales and people like that, tall, skinny guys who don't really fight long. I think a lot of it comes down to having underdeveloped muscles in their back and shoulders. Because if you think about it for a second, you take a little weight, right? Not a heavy weight, let's say it's 2-3 kilos, and you hold that weight close to your head. You're going to be able to hold it up for quite some time before your arm starts hurting. But if you extend your arm out fully and hold that same little weight, you're going to, you know, your arm's going to get tired much more quickly. You see, because it's putting more strain on the shoulder muscle and all the muscles around there. I don't know all the the proper names for the muscles and all that kind of stuff around the shoulder, but it's going to start hurting pretty quickly, right? So you're relying on the strength of the muscles and all that kind of thing in your shoulder to hold it out there. Well, if you're a really skinny guy, you're not going to have that many muscles. Do you know what I mean? That much muscle around that area. So for you to get full extension on your shots, maybe it really tires you out. Do you know what I mean? Maybe it really tires your shoulders and all this kind of stuff. So you have a tendency to throw shorter punches. Whereas tall skinny guys who have muscle on their shoulders, like a Deontay Wilder, yeah, even though he's tall and skinny, there's a lot of muscle there, isn't there? On the shoulder. Deontay Wilder, even Tommy Hearns. You look at, and Tommy Hearns been compared to Hamza Shiraz is really a crime. You know, Shiraz is just, shouldn't even be mentioned next to Hearns in terms of, oh, he's the new Hearns or the British Hearns. He's nothing like Hearns. Hearns had a much more muscular torso, you know, much more muscular shoulders and stuff like that, even though he had skinny arms. So I think he had more strength to be able to extend his arms out constantly, you know, throwing these long-range punches and so on. I probably should have done a separate video, but I did want to sneak that in there. So with Lennox Lewis, longer arms, therefore the short punch, longer arms than Bowe, therefore the short punches weren't quite as fluid as Bowe, even though he did have a good inside game himself. And because they're not long, skinny arms with Lennox Lewis. They were long, big, thick, heavy arms. They get tired quickly. So you'd see Lewis look sloppy in fights, I would say, more than Bowe. As a fight progressed, Lewis started to get a bit tired. His arms would hang down and he'd start looking a little bit clumsy. If you want an example of this, go look at his fight against Shannon Briggs. It wasn't the prettiest performance. Or even look at his fight, the last fight of his career against Vitaly Klitschko. He looked pretty sloppy in that fight too. Riddick Bowe, apart from, let's say, the Galotto rematch, he never really looked that sloppy. You know, his biomechanics, his body mechanics were a bit more conducive to holding his shape. So that's one thing I would say about Riddick Bowe. Held his shape a bit better than Lennox Lewis because his arms weren't quite as long. And also, Lewis was never like an Anthony Joshua, Greek Adonis type of, he never had that kind of physique. But Lewis had a more muscular, athletic-looking physique than Bowe. And sometimes when you have more muscle, it can actually reduce the fluidity. Riddick Bowe didn't have that kind of muscularity that Lennox Lewis even had. Riddick Bowe's physique was, how could you even describe it? He had kind of long striated muscles. There was no six-pack there. Even Bowe, when he was in shape, there was no six-pack. So he had this kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but the way Riddick Bowe's body looked, he looked like someone who's going to be smooth, who's going to be fluid when they throw their punches. That's the only way I can describe it because I'm struggling to find the words. He just looked like a guy, just looking at his build, who's going to be fluid when he throws his shots and when he moves around. And so he was more fluid than Lewis. So yeah, those are the differences I would say, the main ones. The athleticism, physical strength, explosiveness, and versatility for Lewis. And Riddick Bowe was possibly better on the inside, more fluid. I would say his jab was a bit better. And what else could you say about Riddick Bowe? Held his shape better. Yeah, I'd say that. I'd say he held his shape better. Now, in terms of punch resistance, because during their careers, there was this narrative that Lennox Lewis had a bad chin, and you'll still hear Americans today swear blind that Lewis had a terrible chin. It wasn't really true. Lewis had, I would say, an average chin, maybe above average chin, nothing special. He was no Ray Mercer or Oliver McCall or George Chuvalo or even a David Tua. No, but he didn't have a particularly bad chin. If you want to look at fighters of that era that had a bad chin, you're looking at the likes of Michael Moorer at heavyweight. Light heavyweight, different story, but at heavyweight, Michael Moorer's chin was very poor. Herbie Hyde, another guy, poor chin. Tommy Morrison, certainly after the Ray Mercer fight. I think the Mercer fight really destroyed Tommy Morrison's punch resistance. Not that he had an iron jaw prior to that, but his punch resistance didn't seem to be as bad prior to the Mercer fight. But, if you haven't seen that Ray Mercer fight, go watch it. It should have been stopped far sooner than it was. Tommy Morrison took hellacious punches, and I think that potentially could have damaged his punch resistance long term. So there were fighters out there during the era that legitimately had poor chins. Lewis wasn't one of them. You go look at Lewis against Vitaly Klitschko, see all the shots he took in that fight, and then try to tell me he had no chin. You look at Lewis when he fought Ray Mercer, all the shots he took in that fight, and then try to tell me he had no chin. And by the way, in the Ray Mercer fight, Lewis fought a lot on the inside, which he wouldn't typically do against a shorter opponent. One of the reasons that Lewis did that is because the ring was very small. They were originally supposed to fight in a much bigger ring, but it ended up being a small ring. He thinks that was Mercer's people or whatever. I think he said that it was Mercer's people who ensured the ring was going to be small and therefore favoring Mercer. So he was forced to fight on the inside. And he said that they trained for a lot of inside fighting, anticipating that they would have to do it because it was such a small ring, because Lewis, a big tall guy, 6'5", takes 2 steps back and he's already hitting the ropes. But typically Lewis wouldn't engage a shorter opponent on the inside like that. He'd keep him on the outside. So I've lost my train of thought. I'm talking about so many things. My mind's all over the place. but yeah, where was I going? Riddick Bowe, more fluid, better jab. Oh yeah, the chin. That's what I got to. So Riddick Bowe never really fought many punches in his career. And so I think that there was a bit of a false perception regarding his punch resistance, because the narrative at the time was Riddick Bowe had a vastly superior chin to Lennox Lewis. But when you analyze it, Riddick Bowe fought how many punches? He fought Jorge Luis Gonzalez, who never managed to catch him with anything. And how big a puncher was Gonzalez? We don't know. Gonzalez never achieved anything as a pro. He was a very good amateur, but as a pro, he never did anything. The guy trained himself. He was unbelievably arrogant, and it was over before it started with with Gonzalez. Never replicated the success he had in the amateurs as a pro. And Gonzalez, this is the interesting thing, Gonzalez was one of the earliest, I want to say. There may have been fighters before him, but he was one of the earliest elite Cuban heavyweights as an amateur who defected and turned pro in the United States. And yeah, he had the arrogance of somebody who was dominant in the amateurs, but it just didn't translate into the pro game. And did he set the trend? I mean, I don't think anybody was really consciously copying Gonzalez, but there happened to be a trend of Cuban heavyweights defecting, moving to the West, and just falling apart physically. Because in Cuba, it's a very Spartan lifestyle. They don't have much to eat. All they're doing is training, boxing training. That's all they know. And, very little to eat. So they're hungry in the truest sense. When they turn pro and they move to the US, they're in the land of abundance. They can eat as much as they like, fast food everywhere. It overwhelms them a lot of the time. And so many of these Cuban heavyweights would just implode as professionals, even though they were really great amateurs. And that was certainly the case with Jorge Luis Gonzalez. But anyway, he never landed any real big punches on Riddick Bowe to be able to test his chin. And the other guy who you could say was somewhat of a puncher would be Andrew Golota. And Golota beat the brakes off Riddick Bowe twice. The second fight in particular was a real barn burner of a fight. But Golota, being the crazy individual, and he really was genuinely crazy, he ended up being disqualified 2 fights in a row against Riddick Bowe. In fights he was winning. Absolutely bizarre. But yeah, so Riddick Bowe didn't really fight that many punches, if you check it deeply. Holyfield was never known as a serious puncher. He had some power there that you had to respect, but he wasn't like one of the elite level punchers. Herbie-eyed Gonzalez. Whereas with Lennox Lewis, he fought lots of punches. And I'm talking about the elite level punches in the division. So Lewis fought the likes of Razor Ruddock, who was a massive puncher. And most people at the time regarded Ruddock as the biggest puncher in the division behind Mike Tyson. So he fought Razor Ruddock, who was a big puncher. He fought Frank Bruno, who was always a big puncher. Oliver McCall, I mean, he had some power, but he wasn't a prolific puncher. So I'm not going to put him in that category. But if he landed the right shot, he could definitely hurt a lot of people, McCall. Tommy Morrison, though, was a legitimate puncher with a left hook. He was a real strong puncher. Ray Mercer was a pretty good puncher. He's not up there, I don't think, with the Razor Ruddocks and the Frank Brunos in terms of punching power, but he was a pretty good puncher. Ray Mercer, Lewis fought him. Henry Akinwande, I mean, not so much. Again, Andrew Golota, who Riddick Bowe also fought. Shannon Briggs was a good puncher. Lewis fought him, got hit with some big shots off Briggs, came through it and won that fight. Of course, the Holyfield fights. Michael Grant could punch. Lewis walked through him. He did get clipped by a couple of Michael Grant shots in that very short fight. David Tua, of course, real good puncher. Lewis beat him over 12. And then at the end of his career, well, Hasim Ratman had good one-punch power, but he wasn't very prolific. He didn't have the knack of landing that sledgehammer right hand that he landed in the first Lewis fight. He didn't have a knack of landing that consistently. But when it did land, it was a hell of a shot. Mike Tyson, of course, tremendous puncher. Vitaly Klitschko, also a big puncher. So Lewis fought far more big punches than Riddick Bowe. So when you're comparing the chins of the two guys, it's like, yeah, maybe Riddick Bowe suffered, he never got knocked out like Lennox Lewis did. And he was only down, I want to say once. Riddick Bowe was only down once in his career. No. What am I talking about? He was down in the Golota fight, in the second Golota fight. But the first time Riddick Bowe was down in his career as a pro, as far as I can remember, was in the third fight against Holyfield, where he was dropped heavily with a left hook. And that right there, I would say, is Exhibit A. If you want to compare Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe in terms of their chin, Exhibit A would be the third Holyfield-Bowe fight, where Bowe gets hit with a Holyfield left hook and he crashes to the canvas. Now, Lewis took similar left hooks against Evander Holyfield, but he didn't crash to the canvas. So if you want to do a like-for-like comparison, Lewis took Holyfield's shots better. But with that being said, in the first two Holyfield-Bowe fights, Bowe took Holyfield's shots just fine. In fact, in the first fight, the commentators were constantly talking about the fact that Holyfield seemed unable to hurt Bowe. He did wobble Bowe in the second fight, although he never managed to get him on the canvas, but he definitely wobbled him. In fact, that was maybe the round before the Fan Man incident. I think it was. in the round before the Fan Man flew into the ring, Holyfield actually wobbled Riddick Bowe and he had him on the ropes at the end of the round. Then in the next round, it was that crazy Fan Man guy. He's dead, by the way, the Fan Man. Anyway, I'm getting caught up down memory lane at this point, people. You know, I like some memory lane when it comes to the 1990s and the 1980s. But yeah, what was I saying now? Riddick Bowe down against Holyfield. And then, of course, in the Andrew Golota fight, how many times was he down against Golota? I remember him going down early in the fight. Where are we at? Andrew Golota 2. It doesn't actually say here. See, BoxRec, you need to sort the situation out. Okay, it does say here, but on this one it doesn't say. But he was down early in the fight. I want to say it was maybe the second round, first or second round against Golota. He was down, and I think he might have been down another time in the fight. So let's say he was down a couple of times against Golota and once against Holyfield. That would mean he's actually down more times than Lennox Lewis. Lewis was only dropped twice in his career, but on both occasions, it was the end. Whereas Riddick Bowe was able to climb off the canvas and continue. But then the argument would be perhaps Bowe wasn't hit as hard as the shot that Lewis was hit with against, let's say, Oliver McCall or even Hasim Ratman. You know, these are the arguments. But I would say when it comes to chin, there probably isn't that much difference between them in terms of punch resistance. I would say it's pretty similar. Did Bowe have better powers of recovery? It's a strange one with Lewis because the only two times he was stopped, it happened with one punch, right? Against Ratman, he was never going to beat a count of 20 or 30. But against McCall, he did actually get to his feet, but his legs were complete jelly. They had to stop the fight when they did. So it's kind of weird because there are other fights of Lewis's where he takes big shots, like against Vitaly Klitschko, Ray Mercer, Frank Bruno. He takes big shots, gets wobbled, and recovers pretty quick. Do you know what I mean? So Lewis's chin is a little bit of an enigma. I don't think he ever had a glass jaw or a bad chin, but there were times when he seemed to take shots better than other times. You know, it's kind of weird. So I'll leave it there because I'm just rambling at this point and I'm getting caught up down memory lane. So very long-winded answer to a pretty straightforward question. What were the differences between Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe? Hopefully, amidst all of that rambling, you got a satisfactory answer. And yeah, if you haven't seen much of Riddick Bowe before, because I have spoken to some people, I guess they're younger boxing fans and whatever, who haven't seen much of Riddick Bowe. They obviously hear about Lennox Lewis because he went on to achieve a lot more than Riddick Bowe in the pros. Bowe was, of course, undisputed champion when he beat Evander Holyfield, but some people see Bowe as a bit of an underachiever because a lot of the fights that people wanted to see him in never took place, like the Mike Tyson fight, the Lennox Lewis fight, and him against many other fighters in the heavyweight division at the time. And bear in mind, Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe were similar in age. Doesn't actually have Riddick Bowe's birth date on here. Again, that's another thing with boxer they need to sort out. It's got his career and his debut and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't have his birth date. I think Lennox Lewis is 1 or 2 years older than Riddick Bowe. Might be 1 or 2 years older. So yeah, Lewis is older, but it's pretty close. You know, there's not that much difference in terms of age. They're certainly of the same generation. And so the guys that Lewis was facing, you would have liked to see Riddick Bowe fight these guys, right? You would have liked to have seen Riddick Bowe against a Razor Ruddock for sure. Or I mean, some people, even a Frank Bruno and Oliver McCall, you know, the Tommy Morrisons, the Ray Mercer. Imagine Ray Mercer against Riddick Bowe. That would have been a hell of a fight. A hell of a fight. We also got Andrew Gallotta. Well, Bowe did fight him. Shannon Briggs against Riddick Bowe would have been good. Zelko Mavrovich, very underrated. That would have been a good fight for Riddick Bowe. Bear in mind, Andrew Gallotta beat the brakes off Riddick Bowe twice. Zelko Mavrovich arguably is better than Gallotta, right? Riddick Bowe against David Tua is an interesting fight, given the fact that Bowe doesn't keep shorter guys on the outside. He engages them up close. That would have been real interesting to see Riddick Bowe against David Tua. Hasim Ratman, you know, and of course Mike Tyson, Vitaly Klitschko, definitely. So many fights that Riddick Bowe could have had that didn't end up happening because his career was over at quite a young age. I think Riddick Bowe initially retired when he was about 28. It was after the second Gallotta fight, as you can see here, that happened in 1996. And he retired then. I can't remember if this was the point where he joined the Marine Corps. It was a random one. Apparently Riddick Bowe had always wanted to join the United States Marine Corps. And so he went into boot camp and he didn't even last, I think, 2 weeks. They lost 2 weeks in boot camp. I'm not sure whether that was after the Gallotta fight or whether it was during his career before that. But whatever the case may be, he retired either officially or unofficially in 1996 after the Gallotta fight, came back in 2004 and fought Marcus Rode, got rid of him in 2, fought in 2005. Then there was a big hiatus, came back in 2008. He also fought a couple kickboxing fights, didn't he, where he got beat? So yeah, the end of his career was really effectively the second Gallotta fight. He'd taken so much punishment, and as I've said earlier on, Bowe didn't have a great defense. And that's the main reason that his career didn't last that long. Why he was basically washed up and finished by the age of about 27, 28. Because the defense just wasn't there. Had those wars with Holyfield where he took a lot of punishment, and you could hear in interviews Riddick Bowe's speech deteriorating as his career went along. Earlier on in his career, people were comparing him to Ali, and Bowe loved Ali. He idolized Ali. He tried to emulate Ali, talking like him and all this kind of thing. And Bowe was kind of a jovial, somewhat likable character, but he just got hit way too much in the ring. And you heard his speech deteriorate throughout his career. And by the time he was fighting Gallotta, certainly after the second fight, he was slurring his words all over the place. And that's when he drifted off into obscurity. Again, because of that lack of defense combined with the very tough fights with Holyfield, and certainly the fights against Gallotta put a lot of miles on the clock for Riddick Bowe. So anyway, going to leave it there. Again, long-winded, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it nonetheless and got the answer you were looking for. Until next time, I'm out. If you're tired of the biased narratives and mass censorship on mainstream platforms, and you want to be part of a community of critical thinkers who love free speech just as much as you do, then come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide variety of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&As, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got an Element group where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. Unlike Discord, it has full end-to-end encryption, is decentralized, and it's 100% censorship free. You can also send voice notes as well as much larger audio and video files than you can on Discord. So come and sign up on Patreon. There's no contract, there's no commitment. You can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a cup of coffee. So I'll see you over there. I'm out.